Hi there and good evening. Welcome to Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together. It's presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary and I'll be hosting this series of conversations presented throughout Ramadan. Well, we've been busy today and behind us 8 days of Ramadan. Due to technical duties beyond our control, unfortunately, we weren't able to broadcast our special South Africa program yesterday. We apologise if that disrupted any of you. Ramadan is, of course, characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. Last year, Affinity hosted over 45 house iftars and 10 institutional iftars, including up to 350 guests. Well, this year, COVID-19 has made that impossible. So Affinity has decided to carry Ramadan to an online platform. Ramadan Conversations, we're all in this together, is a daily 1-hour live Ramadan conversation where each episode will be streamed live and later uploaded on Affinity's YouTube page for you to have a look again or pass it on to your friends. As a former ABC broadcaster with a special interest in religion, it's my great pleasure to host these conversations together with a number of assistant hosts drawn from the Muslim community to assist us. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Muhammad Aksu. Dr. Aksu worked as a high school teacher for more than a decade. He's currently the director of Blue Star Intercultural Centre, a Canberra-based interfaith and intercultural dialogue organisation, and his PhD research was on the cultural analysis of Muslim screen representations. Muhammad, thanks so much for joining us. You've just finished your doctorate on the way Muslims are portrayed in film and television. So what's your analysis show?
Good evening, John. Hope you're well.
Terrific.
Well, my PhD took almost 10 years, so it was a form of torture for me, you could possibly say. But yeah, I was looking at screen representations of Muslims. I looked at good representations of Muslims, if we like to use the term good, or good characterizations, and how they kind of fit in the narratives. And some of the things that I found in my analysis is that Muslims need to be good citizens. They need to be far and away from extremism. They can't be very political. They can't be very critical of the countries, the Western countries in which they live in. So in other words, they need to be, well, let's not say
Model
one-dimensional,
citizens.
but yeah, model citizens. They're not allowed to rebel, or they're not allowed to have crises or any kind of political issues towards the world around them. They need to be grateful that they are part of Western society, and they're going to do as good as they can to be model, upstanding citizens. Generally, yeah.
What period were you looking at? How many years?
It's actually
1950s
well, the first positive representation of Muslims kind of props up in the 1980s in a BBC Robin Hood TV serial.
I remember.
Oh, you probably do. You probably do. It's a really good show. So we kind of started in 1983, and all the way across to about 2018, across different genres and different types of film and television shows. I also had a close look at East West 101, which was a show on SBS from about 10 years ago. Don Haney played a Lebanese detective in it. I don't know if you ever got to see it, which was one of the shows that I kind of analysed in my thesis. Yeah, it was a love-hate relationship with my thesis, and it's behind me now, so thank God for that.
Now that you've absorbed it all, you've committed yourself to work with Blue Star, as we've said. Can you just tell us a little bit about what Blue Star is?
So Blue Star is the Canberra-based sister organisation of Affinity, which is the organisation that that made this program possible. So similar to Affinity, we try to connect with people from different cultural and religious backgrounds, try to create platforms from which different people can get to know about each other, contribute to social harmony and finding out more about each other. So the intro that you introduced us with today kind of rang to us as well. We would have been full swing doing Ramadan programs and initiatives and iftars and I'm stuck at home with the kids. So that's how it is this year.
Now, you're a Canberra resident, and Canberra
Yes.
seems to be being the city that's bending the COVID curve for Australia. Is there something about the place?
Oh, well, I think a lot of people will say it's just boring. There's nothing to do there, so everybody stays at home. But I'm not gonna go down that. I'm not gonna go down that path. I think Canberrans are a wonderful lot. They're great people, very responsible, very careful, and it's just lucky that we've got such wide open spaces, plenty of room to exercise, and still get out and do those good things without having to come into a lot of contact with other people. And we copped it during the fire season more than anybody else.
Yeah.
So I think in a bit of karmic retribution, we got it a little bit better than the rest of Australia this time around. I think it's
You,
just fair.
you learnt the lessons of community very well. Well, it's time now to introduce the first of this evening's guest, and we're off across the continent to say hi to Dr. Anne Ali. Before becoming the Labor member for Cowan in Perth, Dr. Ali was professor at Edith Cowan University, where she had become an internationally renowned expert in counter-terrorism and counter-radicalisation. She's published over 100 articles and books on topics related to terrorism and international security. Anne happened to be the only Australian to be invited to President Barack Obama's White House conference on violent extremism in 2015. Anne Ali, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, John, and good evening, gentlemen. Salam alaikum, Mohammed.
Wa alaikum salam, good evening.
And what led you from the specialised world of terror into the open fields of community representation and politics?
I don't know that terror and politics is that much different, but it's
Oh God.
it's a story of, I think, a little bit of serendipity and it was just I was at a stage in my life and in my career where I had achieved as much as I wanted to achieve and as much as I could achieve in the world of academia, and of course I also had a not-for-profit that I was running as well, that also worked with young, vulnerable people, and I had gotten to a point in my career where I really was traveling the world and speaking. I was an advisor to the United Nations. I was speaking at international forums alongside the UN Secretary General. But I didn't feel like I had the capacity to make the change that I wanted to see, because I felt that change lacked political will, and that the change that I felt was necessary, and that the things that I felt were necessary to make Australia a better country lacked political will. And so it just so happened that after a stint in Europe, where I'd been to the Club de Madrid, which is not a disco, sadly, it is a policy dialogue, a policy forum, and then I'd been to the UN to talk about judicial responses to terrorism among member states, I'd walked out of there and I felt quite disheartened, and I felt like I'd been travelling the world but not achieving much, and doing all of these speaking gigs but not really making effective change. And it just so happened that on the way back, my husband and I, who came with me to Europe, we stopped in Bali for a little bit of a summer break, and I got a phone call that I didn't answer because I didn't know the number. And then I got a text message saying, "Hey, Anne, this is WA Labor. Can you give us a call?" I wasn't political. I didn't know what it was they could possibly had wanted. So I rang my son, who was a member of Young Labor and quite active in the party. And I said to him, "What do you think they want?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, Mum. Maybe they want you to run in the next election." And I said, "There's an election? When?" That's how little I knew. Anyway, I ended up meeting with them, and I said, why should I do this? I've got a fabulous career. I travel the world. I'm really at the height of my career. I've got enough research to keep me going for another 10 years. I've got ARC grants and research money, and I run a research institute. Why would I leave all of that and do this? And they said, because it would be a different way to make change. And they had me. And I said yes.
Hey,
And
Mohammed, how does Anne fit your stereotype that you spent years developing as a model for your PhD?
Yeah. She's come to the right. She's come along the right way. She's upstanding moral citizen and has succumbed to the temptations of Western values. So yeah, she's upright, but probably not as, from what I've heard when I hear her speak in Parliament and stuff. Probably not in the way that the West wants it always to be. I think at times she can be a little bit, a little bit too much from what I know.
It pays to
make
be
trouble
edgy in
wherever you go.
politics.
That's right. Yeah.
And how do you think we're dealing with COVID as a nation? I mean, the curve, as I mentioned with Mohammed, seems to be turning quite significantly. And what do you think that says about
and
us?
it's the same in Perth. I mean, we've been really lucky in Western Australia and in Canberra. We've really locked it down, and we're allowed to have 10 people gather. I think I wrote a piece about this the other day, and one of the things that I said in that piece, or that I wrote in that piece, was that in today's security environment, there are so many unknowns. There are so many new players that we're not used to, individuals, non-government organisations, pandemics, and we have to find a new way of talking about security, because what we've seen with this is that the enemy isn't somebody wielding a gun or a suicide vest, right? And the heroes, the people who we're relying on to get us out of this, are wearing scrubs and face masks. We cannot bomb our way out of this. We cannot arrest our way out of this. We cannot legislate our way out of this. And we can't shoot our way out of this. This is so new in terms of a threat to our security and our well-being. And I think what this has reminded us, and I think there's opportunity here for us to stop and pause and think about, what is it that we value? We talk about economics, but what about well-being? What about individual well-being, and what about community well-being? What about social well-being? And how we measure that as resilience to contemporary threats, to threats that we haven't seen in the past, like pandemics. In terms of how we're doing, there's no playbook. There's no baseline for us to assess ourselves against. And so I guess, we will look back, and hindsight is always a wonderful thing, and we'll look back and we'll say we shoulda, coulda, woulda. But the fact is, we don't know. And it's a really strange situation for people to be in, because I think normally people don't like change. Human beings, we don't like, I like it. I like disruption and changes, as Mohammed mentioned. I like to be a little bit different. But it's a real time for us to assess what's important, but also how we're going to meet future challenges, because we cannot continue to meet future challenges in ways that we used to meet them, because the challenges are so much different.
And adding to what you said, it's people in scrubs that were the heroes now, and it was people with hoses and firefighters who were the heroes a few months ago. And once again, a very different threat and a very different look at way that we're going to look to the future.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting, Mohammed, because I'm used to talking about threats in terms of someone wielding a suicide vest, or a terrorist organisation planning a mass attack. But it's interesting that now the threat is so different, and it's so diffuse, and so you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it. in many ways. And so we are now in a position where we're forced to look at what does resilience mean, what does defence mean, and it's not what we thought it was or what we used to rely on.
Mohammed, probably you would follow on from that too, because I think with a shared faith tradition, you guys for most faith traditions, we can talk across barriers to people we know in that faith tradition because you talk in coded language, you know what it means. And perhaps, Mohammed, for you and for Anne, when you look at this, a year like this, where Ramadan comes in the midst of a very stressful period, what to do for the community? Mohammed, perhaps you first, and then Anne can respond.
Oh, it's been very interesting. Like, you've basically gone online. We had WhatsApp groups to connect with each other in our community here in Canberra, for an example, as Muslim community. But we've started having online, spiritual talks, and we're trying to distribute food to people who might not have as much as they do. We've got a lot of international Muslim students here who are having it hard because they're not able to work, impacted by COVID. So yeah, we're still trying to get out there. It's really, really different. Like the mosque is a focal point in Ramadan, and you can't go. Like today was Friday. Yeah. Today, I'm mixing up the days. Today was Friday, and normally you'd go to the mosque, but in the last 5-6 weeks you haven't gone, and it's just like you remember it in your heart every once in a while, but you've become detached from it, and we've never experienced something like this. There was a bit of fear around the mosque after Christchurch after last year. That the fear of what could possibly happen, and you kind of worried when you went into a mosque during that period. But now you can't even go, and it's something that is so different. But people of faith and Islam as a religion is quite flexible, and it's people have lived under pandemics in the past, people have lived under war, and there's always ways to go forward as long as you have the right mindset about serving your community and bringing people together in different ways. So I think there's been some really positive things about it, a lot more time to contemplate, a lot more time on your own to read, etc. But very different. And, you'll always remember it, I think.
And just finally, how is it for you? And I guess I should ask you if there's anything that you've found during this period that you say, oh, look, I must continue to do that after all this is over.
For us it's Ramadan, but let's not forget Easter was also during the COVID-19. And I know a lot of friends for whom, going to church at Easter time has been a long-held family tradition, and they weren't able to do that. This morning I attended a funeral, a Catholic funeral, by video link. A very, very dear friend and someone who's been a great strength in the multicultural community here in WA passed away last week, Olga Ramasamy. So her funeral was on today. And I keep in contact with a lot of my faith communities here in my electorate, which, interestingly, my electorate doesn't have a mosque, but it has a Sikh Gurdwara, and it's got several Hindu mandals, and it's got a number of churches, and it's got a significant Latter-day Saints population as well. So I'm very, very blessed in that I have this rich faith community, and it's such a diverse faith community that I can connect with, and we do connect, and we connect on that kind of that shared belief systems and shared faith, and shared sense of community as well. So for me, in terms of what it's like during Ramadan, it's actually a little bit easier for me because I'm not traveling and I'm not doing the kind of the events that I normally do. So I'm working from home, and it's actually a lot easier to fast every day. if it can be easier. But I thank God that it's made easier for me this Ramadan, and I actually feel like I can really get into the spirit of Ramadan, not so much in terms of. Yes, I do miss the fact that we have family, that we gather, and when we break fast and all of that part of it. But the fast itself is not just a refrain from food and drink. It's a refrain from a whole lot of other worldly distractions. And I've actually found that in the isolation period, being able to fast in isolation has actually made it a lot easier, and it kind of facilitates more of this reflection that's part of Ramadan. We think of Ramadan for the food and the breaking of the fast and the sweets and all the really good stuff, and the family and the coming together of community and the prayer and all of that. But I also find Ramadan a very a time for solitude as well, and self-reflection. And I think that it's being in isolation or being in the lockdown period has enhanced that experience for me. And perhaps that's the good thing that we can take away from all of this. That
Yes.
there's time for breathing now.
Definitely.
Dr. Anne Ali, thanks so much for joining us and bringing that understanding of Ramadan to us. Thank you once again.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're on Ramadan Conversations, brought to you by the Affinity Foundation. I'm John Cleary. Our co-host is Dr. Muhammad Aksu. And Muhammad, our next guest is Associate Professor Mehmet Ozalp. Mehmet is an Islamic theologian and a public intellectual. He established the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University in 2011. He's the founding director of Islamic Sciences and Research Academy of Australia in 2009. And he received his PhD from the University of Sydney, and he's also the author of 3 books. Mehmet Ozalp, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Thanks for having me, John.
It's great to have you here, Mehmet. What role for you, given that you're a theologian and a public author, you look at Ramadan occurring at a time like this, what role does faith play in times such as this?
It plays extremely important role, especially in relations to the coronavirus matter and the lockdowns, now that Ramadan comes along the way. Islam sees the tribulations of life as a test, in a kind of seeing life and difficult circumstances as a test has a strengthening effect and gives us resilience, because it implies that the test will come, that test will finish, and that if we persevere patiently, we will be rewarded. So that is a broad perspective, or Islamic perspectives on life's tribulations. But at the same time, sometimes people can use religion in the wrong way, especially they were very quick, not only with Muslims, but also with other faith traditions, to declare that the pandemic was God's punishment upon humanity for their excesses and destruction of the environment. Well, maybe it is like we can't read the mind of God, as they say, in a way. However, a thought like that can make us complacent and fatalistic in a way, and that's certainly not good. Unfortunately, only a minority of Muslims kind of were voicing that. The majority of the Muslims said that the pandemic was, yes, it was not in our control for this to come out, whichever way it came out. But nevertheless, the spread of it is up to us. So we can't just fatalistically rely on God. We have to take precautions, and and measures so that it spread to protect our lives. Actually, there's a bit of a story with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He's with a man there about to go into a mosque, and the man just leaves his camel in front of the mosque. The customary thing is to a wood. He doesn't tie it, and when the Prophet says, "Why haven't you tied it?" He says, "I'm relying on God." So in a way, the camel just can wander around. He's saying, "I'm relying on God for the protection of the camel," and the Prophet said very wisely, "First tie your camel, then rely on God." So this story gets a lot of Muslims know this, and it's a very good argument that there are things that we have to do, and there are things is in the court of God, as they say. So we cannot interfere in God's works. So we need to focus on what we need ourselves.
I think there's an attraction to pondering over apocalypse and end of times and all these kinds of things. You see all these movies, post-apocalyptic ones, and things like that. So even when I was young and I was, you'd speak to an imam or a sheikh, one of the first questions is like, "So when's the end of time, sheikh?" And the sheikh would tell you, "Well, you just worry about yourself. Don't worry about things like that." But there's an inherent, we have a fascination. And these kinds of things are, peak in times like these, in these interesting times that we live in.
Yeah.
Well,
Remember
certainly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Certainly, it's become a cliche now to declare this as unprecedented, occurrence. Certainly, it is. I've never seen something like this in my life. It's only something you see in movies, or you read in apocalyptic predictions. There is some merit to that, but obviously we never know when will world end. And the Islamic perspective is that only God knows. Even Prophet Muhammad said, "I don't know." He was questioned.
Yes, we should set aside some time for a few Christian end timers and a few Muslim end timers to get together and share, see if they can line up their dates.
That would be
Quite
amazing.
profitable, I think. And perhaps, Mehmet, this is something that your Islamic Sciences and Research Academy could benefit from. Can I ask you, Mehmet, quite seriously, you've established the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy to with the assistance of universities in Australia. What do you see as the ongoing contribution of such a body to the wider Australian society?
Well, we have established the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy, which is a community organization, but also we've signed up a partnership deal with Charles Sturt University to offer Islamic studies courses at undergraduate and postgraduate level. And we've been doing that now for the last 10 years. And I'm really happy to say that through our courses, 1,800 enrollments so far, and more than 250 graduates. So obviously higher learning in any religion is very important, and we need institutions to provide that rather than people going overseas. Prior to us, Muslims had to go overseas if they wanted to really seriously study Islam, and we all know issues with that. At the least, overseas ignores the conditions and context in Australia. At worst, it can lead to radicalization and so on. So we have started something that's really good, that Muslims now can study Islam from within the tradition in an Australian university. And that was a time when we launched it, and we're now in our 10th year. In that process, we started with 1.5 kind of academics. Even I was a PhD candidate at the time. Now we have 12 academics in our center. So it's the biggest Islamic studies faculty in Australia, with 2 associate professors and 8 with PhDs. Hopefully there will be others And we're also conducting some very important research as well. One of our faculty was Dr. Daria Inar. She has published 2 reports, Islamophobia in Australia. The second report was published in November last year, and it had wide media coverage. And according to our estimates, worldwide, 725 million people have reached that report. So I mean, it's not good to have a problem like Islamophobia in Australia. I wish it wasn't there, but if it's there, we need to measure it and report it properly, objectively, with an academic lens. So we are really contributing to some groundbreaking research. That's just one example. And I'm now conducting a research into Muslim youth in Australia. And I've got some data, and we're just analyzing that data. And it's very different to what I was expecting as well. And hopefully in the future, if these kind of programs continue, we can talk about it. So a center like ours really lifted the level of Islamic education in Australia, and other organizations are kind of trying to follow suit. And we're really happy that we were pioneers in this field.
Well, just briefly before we leave you, coming out of this this difficult period, what are your hopes and fears as we emerge from this very different Ramadan?
We are really going from day to day, but as they say now, the world will never be the same. I think what we really discovered is 2 things. Firstly, the power of online medium. We're now able to have this conversation online. A lot of educational institutions who are resisting going online will now embrace it. Second thing also is we also now feel the real value of human contact. I think we have taken that for granted, and after this, every gathering will be somewhat different. At least in our generation, the generation of young people who never went through any tribulation, big trials like World War II, World War I or Great Depression, are going through good times. It really makes it characterizes a nation, these big tribulations, and I'm that some good things will come out of it. Will toughen and harden this generation.
Mehmet Ozal, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
And now it's time for a short break in our Ramadan conversation to share a musical interlude. And it's from the Sufi tradition, brought to us by Salih Ristoglu. Thank you, Sally. That's delightful, Mohammed.
Amazing.
I wish I understood any of that tradition, but the sort of diversity of musical instruments is just immense. It's just wonderful. Well, our next guest is Professor Stephen Pickard. Stephen is Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture in Canberra and Professor of Theology at Charles Sturt University. He's also an ordained Anglican and Assistant Bishop of the Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn. He's Deputy Chair of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Standing Commission on Unity, Faith and Order, and a member of the Doctrine Commission of the Anglican Church of Australia. Stephen Pickard, welcome to this Ramadan Conversation.
Thank you, John. It's lovely to be with you.
Good evening, Stephen.
Good evening, Mohammed.
Stephen, our earlier guest, Mohammed Ozalp, spoke about the pandemic in the history of Islam. He mentioned that, we learn from these things. It seems that religion at its best sees its best in times of crisis. What about the history of Christianity? Has Christians been much the same?
I think that's the case, John. If I just might take these, does that sound a bit better from your point of view?
You're okay. Yeah.
All good.
How's that?
Yeah, it's good.
Does that sound coming through?
Yeah,
Yes,
can you
yes.
hear us?
Yeah, fine. Look, pandemics and plagues and what have you have been a feature of the human race for thousands of years. And within the history of the Christian tradition, certainly in the 4th century and then in the plagues in the Middle Ages, it brings out the best and the worst in human beings, and Christians are no different. But in particular, the history of Christianity on this matter is that often Christians have been at the forefront of care. I was thinking of earlier plague in the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th century, where it deeply offended the pagan emperors at the time that Christian priests and people were offering their lives in some sense of self-sacrifice to go out and tend to those that were the sick and dying, it's seemingly without any thought whatsoever for their well-being. It's been a feature of many religious traditions, not just peculiar to Christianity, but in my understanding, certainly the Christian Church has always come to the fore on such occasions.
Christianity, Islam and Judaism, like Buddhism and Hinduism, are recognised as great religions because in a profound sense they help shape their civilizations. And despite their deep differences, they also seem to share some common profound truths. Which of those common elements are most vital for us to retain this shared social identity that we have?
Well, that's such a great question, John. I have just written a piece on this matter I've called it, in the time between Easter and Pentecost, it's a remarkable time of 7 weeks from the traditional Jewish tradition of from Passover to the barley harvest. And in the Christian tradition, Pentecost is the great outpouring of the Spirit. And I describe this time that we're in with this pandemic as an occasion for the outpouring of compassion. And I think that's one of the fundaments of the Christian tradition and shared across the religious traditions. My friends and colleagues, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, and others, this element of compassion, which is deeply DNA encoded into human life, will often erupt spontaneously on such occasions of deep need and where human beings are really pushed to the limit of their lives. You see this, one of my friends called it explosion of compassion. And I think that's a fundamental value of the Christian tradition, but of course not only. I was thinking of the Gospels and Jesus. The word used is he is moved in his deepest inner reaches. In fact, in his splendour, in his bowels, the seat of the emotion and the heartfelt going out to others. I think this is such a fundamental matter, and you see it today in the frontline response to people who are sick and dying in this pandemic.
And it's something that, of course, Muhammad is reflected in Ramadan.
Definitely, it's an important part of Ramadan. That compassion is key. When God introduces when God introduced himself to the Prophet Muhammad and to us as Muslims, he described himself as being the merciful and the compassionate before any other name. So he introduced himself to us, and it's a central tenet of it's a great time of giving. Generally, Muslims will make their big charity of the year in Ramadan because they believe there is extra benefit and bounty that come with it. And even the Ramadan iftars that have become so, become interfaith and intercultural things. The idea is that I should break bread with somebody else in my home at that time, or I should provide something to those who are less fortunate at this time. And yeah, it needs to manifest itself all across society. Like when Stephen was mentioning this, I remembered a couple of months ago during the fires, Stephen, in Canberra, and and the way that people came together to send down, millions of dollars worth of things to the fireys and to those communities affected on the south coast and across New South Wales and the ACT. And it was just spontaneous, it was sincere, and it was a sight to behold, and it was an amazing thing that some of us had the pleasure of being a part of. And it's, as you said, times of crisis can lead to those kinds of responses, and we've seen that.
It also seems that the type of response draws out an active response from the faith traditions. It's the faith in action, Stephen.
Absolutely, it's not just a lovely concept or a theological idea. Although I really love theological ideas, it actually is it is the practice of the idea, which is where the rubber hits the road. And people have got their antenna up for this, and they can see the difference between people who say pleasant things. There's a lovely passage in the New Testament. You say to your brother or your sister, "Be well," and look after yourself, and then go your own way. I mean, it's quite hypocritical. So it is faith in action that really is the difference between being real and being disconnected and not compassionate. Even the word itself, compassion, from the notion of pathos, of suffering, and being with others in their suffering rather than at a distance. I think that's the key thing.
Stephen Pickard, that's probably an appropriate place to wind this thought up. But Muhammad, you may want to add something there too.
I was just going to ask Stephen, besides that being a kind of blessing from the pandemic, what else has been a positive aspect of the pandemic for you, Stephen?
Well, I'm speaking entirely personally because, and I need to make a caveat, there are many people that are suffering. There are many households where it's difficult, and we've heard all about that. For me personally, it's been quite a strange time of solitude and not being in the normal hurly-burly of my life, running institutions. Although I've entered into Zoomland, which is a place which is quite exhausting, even though it may be efficient. But what I have discovered is I've started to live more slowly and given a little bit more time to things that need to be attended to. And also in my own life, there's so much that happens in the public space that I get very little occasion and time to attend to the, as I would call it, the back of house matters. And so this strange time has been has had a strange blessing in it for me personally, of a little bit more reflective, something more to do with the inward journey, time to pause, frankly, time to purge and get rid of a lot of things. And somewhat anecdotally, I discovered that when I started cleaning out our garage and our shed and some other things, and I took these things to the local tip, there were hundreds of other cars doing exactly the same thing. These occasions give us somewhat unwelcome, but nevertheless important opportunity to do some clearing out of things, and both in the physical and personal and material, but also in the inner world too. So there is the potential for a blessing here if we are attentive to God and God's ways with us. That's my own personal experience.
Stephen Pickard, thank you so much for joining this Ramadan conversation.
It's been a pleasure, John, and lovely to be with you on this occasion. I'm just conscious, if I can say, this time in the last 10, 12 years, the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture has been joining with Blue Star and Mohammed and his predecessors in most wonderful celebrations of Iftar. And I really regret that we are not able to do that this year. And so this is a real wonderful way to have a blessing and share that. And I hope that is the experience of many.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks again. Well, now on this Ramadan conversation, it's time to meet our final guest. And Mohammed, it's a pleasure to welcome our final guest as a person many regard as one of the truly great Australians, Emeritus Professor Ron McCallum, AO. He's a distinguished Australian. After an academic career, Ron has become a world-recognised expert on industrial and labour law. It's taken him to teaching posts in Canada, the United States, and here in Australia, to Monash University in Melbourne, and then as Foundation of Professor in Industrial Law at the University of Sydney, where he also served as Dean of the Law School. Ron was the inaugural president of the Australian Labour Law Association. Now, what's so remarkable about all of this is that this distinguished career is led by someone who is totally blind. Ron McCallum is the first totally blind person to have been appointed to a professorship in any field at any university in Australia or New Zealand. And if that's not enough, his interest and expertise also extends to much wider fields. In October 2009, Professor McCallum was unanimously elected as chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. For his consistent work in this area, he became an Officer of the Order of Australia and in 2011 was announced as that year's Senior Australian of the Year. Ron McCallum, it's a delight to have you with us.
It's lovely to be here, John and Dr. Mohammed, and to be at this iftar.
Your career on industrial law has seen a remarkable series of shifts in workplace relations. Coming out of the Great Depression and then World War II, there was a sense of the need to shape a new world order with the foundation of the UN, the emergence of what became known as the welfare state, In Australia, that was supported by an industrial system that even harked back to the famous 1908 Harvester judgment, where it established a basic wage sufficient for a family to live in frugal comfort. It was backed by a strong union movement. Now, today, all of that seems to have changed, starting in the 1970s, spurred on in the 1980s by the Hawke and Keating deregulation in Australia, and internationally by Margaret Thatcher's famous "there's no such thing as society" and Ronald Reagan's view that government is the problem. There's been a consistent push to deregulate, even to dismantle many of those global institutions and local regulations. Casualisation now marks much of our workplace. Does it seem that we've almost come full circle? Do years like this, with both bushfires and now COVID, indicate a rethink of the balance in our society on the nature of community, both locally and globally, is in order?
Often legal changes occur after crises. The first labour laws in Britain were after the Black Death. Our early arbitration laws were after the huge strikes of the 1890s, the American laws after the Depression. And I think this COVID-19 has shown us that we are all in this together, and we're seeing some of the cracks in the old system. The fact that casual employees don't really get sick leave and just get a payment. We're finally seeing governments raising Newstart, or what used to be called Newstart, to a proper level. I hope we cannot go back. I hope that we think about a fairer order for people. We still have a long way to go. I'm surprised that persons with visas and migrants cannot get JobKeeper or JobSeeker payments even though they pay taxes. I think it's time for us to have a reset, to do away with a lot of casualisation. We have to be very clear and stand up for ourselves and not make it that it's only corporations that profit out of this. We're all in this together, we're all suffering, and we need to think, how do we look after each other? And surely that's a Muslim and a Christian and a Judaic value, a value of collectivity, particularly on this day of 1st of May.
Mohammed.
It's amazing. Ron, we've seen our nightly news, the impact of COVID-19 on the aged care sector. But what about the difficulties faced by those with disabilities? Many of them who I would imagine would be housebound at the moment.
It is a real problem, Dr. Mohammed. I am a senior advisor to the Royal Commission into Disability at the moment, and we put out a statement to the government saying, we think you haven't thought enough about we persons with disabilities. In Europe, where the pandemic has been at its worst, there have been high death rates of my sisters and brothers with disabilities in institutions and places where large numbers are housed. And therefore we were pleased eventually that the government did respond. But many of my sisters and brothers find it difficult to get home workers, and we're in the same position, some of us, as people in aged care homes. So it's very important. In most disasters, it's children and the disabled who bear the brunt. At the moment, it's our elderly, and I'm elderly, and the disabled, so I fulfill both criteria. And we mustn't forget the weaker people in society. You know, if you read the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be to his name, is very clear about we should show kindness to those who don't have what we have or who are suffering from disability. The Prophet mentions blindness from memory.
Indeed. For many years, you've advocated the rights and protection of refugees, and you've already mentioned them, in particular refugees with disabilities. They seem to be a forgotten group, as you refer to them, forgotten refugees. What particularly faces them in Australia at the moment, and even in wider fields? We think of what's happening in Syria on the borders with Turkey.
Well, they face getting food, getting shelter, because often they don't get the COVID, they don't get the benefits of some of our welfare laws. Look, when we started, Professor Mary Crock and I were married, started working in this, people told us, well, there aren't any refugees with disabilities because they don't travel. We found that the percentage of refugees with disabilities is higher than the 15% in our community. Many refugees suffer from post-traumatic stress. They're as disabled as many of our veterans, and we shouldn't forget this. And the government has a duty for all refugees on the territory of Australia, particularly disabled refugees, to make sure that we as a community are looking after them. And again, that is Islamic, Christian, and Judaic principles.
Ron, as someone who's spent much of their career in the tertiary sector, with universities, what are the immediate challenges that the universities and their students are facing?
One of the big challenges is the loss of money. And I don't think we will get back large numbers of foreign students. And if I can say, I don't think our ministers should be haranguing China at the moment. It's certainly the wrong time. They expect us to, the students to come back. I think I'm worried about the younger academics. We won't be hiring as many people. I think the university sector will shrink. And while online classes are important, and I'm teaching them at the moment, we don't want to shed teachers just for multiple online classes. We want to keep up the research levels of universities. I don't think the government realises that it's our third biggest export industry for dollars, and we're not taking care of it.
It's a huge issue.
In the midst of all of this, we each have to keep going, and we're living through periods where we're going through things that we've never been through before as individuals. Is there anything you've started since the lockdown that you're going to keep doing once the pandemic's over, when it's all past?
Yeah. Yes, we walk every morning with our dog to the park, and I love listening to the birds. There's the children, mums and dads and grandparents, and I really miss touch. We have grown-up children. I can't hug them. Although I can talk to them, I can't see them, and I really feel that I am a bit isolated without touch. So I will look forward to holding people's hands, of being close. But I will continue my walks in the park to watch the people from the toddlers to the octogenarians. And it's great to see the community all keeping social distance, all walking, all enjoying the sunshine.
Ron McCallum, great thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed.
Well, Mohammed, that's just about all we have time for in today's program. Thanks for being part of the team. I look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you for having me, John. It's been a wonderful hour that we've shared together, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, I think we could chat about what each of our guests has said for another hour.
Definitely.
Really
What a panel.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. And thank you all at home or wherever you happen to be for joining us in this Ramadan conversation. Our next episode will be tomorrow. And you have followed up our episodes. Our program has hosted a number of distinguished guests. And if you wish to view this or any of the series of Ramadan conversations, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel.
Can I just add something, John?
Yes,
just wanted to say that tomorrow's broadcast will be from Melbourne, and if I'm not wrong, Mr. George Danikian is going to be hosting. You're going to have a few days off, I think. They've really put you through the ringer this week, I think.
I'm going to need to have a chance to do my own sort of isolation.
That's right. You need some time to yourself. Anyway, guys, stay safe and have a blessed Ramadan. Good night.